Hey there, CS360 students. So in this recording, I'm going to go through the details of shared preferences and then working with some files in an Android application. So first thing we start off with here are what are called shared preferences. And what these are key value pairs that are stored to an XML file internally to the app data directory in an Android application. So before you get scared off on all that, the nice thing about this is this shared preferences is really abstracted away from the user. So you can store things like settings that could be later retrieved in the application, or you could update the settings. And so you have a nice way of working with data that could be persisted on the actual device. So let's come down here and let's see how we get the access to shared preferences. So again, what it's going to do is it's going to work with an XML file kind of under the hood. And there are two context methods that exist to create or access these preference files. And what I mean by context is an activity or a fragment have a context that they contain as a reference. So as long as you're in one of those kinds of files, you can use these methods for free. Now, this get shared preferences method here, it opens or creates a preference file using a given file name. And that's the example they have right here. So they've got get shared preferences, and they're just calling the file my prefs. And then you can see that they provided a mode for private, so that way it's not accessible outside. If we just use get preferences, then this would just default to a file locally. To be honest, I don't know exactly what name it would get, but under the covers somewhere it would have a default name. Uh, Once we have a reference to the shared preferences here, you then have an editor. So we go shared preferences.editor, and we call the shared pref variable that we got back here, and we call the .edit method. And then what we can do is we can put either strings or integers or booleans to the shared preferences. The way that this works is you provide it the key, and then you provide it the value that you want associated with that key. Same thing with an integer. Here's the key, and then here is the integer value that's associated with it. Once you've made your updates to the preference value, you then call editor.apply, and these values would then be saved into the XML file, as you see here, where it's got the name value, name attribute, and then the value attribute over here. Now, one thing that I highly recommend is that I would create a manager class that handles all of this functionality. And so let me kind of show you how I've hooked that up in an Android application that I support. So here's my little Android application right here, and the settings menu. Again, I like to use the shared preferences to save off settings. So right here you can see display settings, and I can change a preference right here. So right now it's minutes per mile, or I can change it to minutes per kilometer. And so if I go back, if I do a calculation, you can see that I'm calculating in terms of kilometers. If I change the settings back to minutes per mile, you can see that these are now in terms of miles instead of kilometers. So again, this is a setting that is being maintained in the app. Perfect usage of the shared preferences. Now, here's how I go about handling these preferences, because I really want this to be accessible anywhere, and I want to make it available through one manager type code. So I create a class called Preferences Manager here, and you can see that it has a reference to that shared preference variable, just like you saw back in zyBooks. So right here, I've got the shared preferences variable, and then you can also see that I actually have an editor variable. So I even have a reference to the editor, just like you saw in the zyBooks code. Now, I also use constants for the keys that I'm going to be using. So display setting, that's this attribute right here. So you can see I'm maintaining several different types of attributes here. So if I come down here, the way that this class works is I'm going to use a singleton pattern where I have a single static instance of the preference manager variable. And then I have a private constructor where it has to have the context. Remember, I said to get able to use the get shared preferences method. So in order to use get shared preferences or get preferences, you have to have the context. And since this is not an activity or a fragment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the context in the constructor, and then I can use the get shared preferences method as you see right here. So I am using just a, it's going to be called info, and there's my shared preferences context variable right there. And then I went ahead and newed up the editor as well, and I called editor.apply. So that's the constructor, and then you can see that I provide an initialize method right here. So you have to call initialize before you can reference the get instance method. So in initialize, you give it the context, and then it will then new up the preferences manager singleton. And so in my get instance method, you can see if instance is null, that means it has not been initialized. So I throw an exception if that's the case. Otherwise, it's already existing, and I just return an instance of my shared preferences reference right there. And again, rather than having the code potentially be copied and pasted, so let's suppose that this code, there's only one place where this gets set, but let's say that it's being accessed in multiple ways. So what I want to do is in here, I provide a way to set the setting as well as get the setting. So setting the setting is very similar to what we saw in the zyBooks code. I've got a public method that is going to provide the input value. So it's a Boolean. It's either a true or a false in this settings right here. So it's just a Boolean of if it's miles or not. And so you can see I call my editor. It's a single variable inside this class. I do put Boolean, and then I'm calling the key, that's a constant value, with the new value that's coming in, and then I call editor.apply. So I can set this from any place I want to, as long as I just use the preferences manager get instance method. Okay, so let's take a look at how we retrieve the value. So if we scroll down here to retrieve the value, what we're going to do is, again, we have our shared preferences variable. You can see here that they're using the get preferences method. And then we go into shared pref. And then now you have to call the correct method. If it's a float or an integer or a string or a Boolean, you call the get float, get int, get string, get Boolean method, giving it the key that's associated with what you want back from the preferences. And then, oh, by the way, you can provide a default value if it has not been created yet. So again, I'm not a big fan of doing something like this here outside of a manager implementation, because then I have to remember what is my key value, and then it just makes it difficult. So if you go back to my implementation here, so in the is display settings miles. So in the getter method for this, I call the shared pref, get Boolean, just like we saw over on the other side, and then here's my constant value. And then I'm defaulting it to a true case here. So again, what I've done is any setting that I have in my application, I've provided a setter for it as well a getter that goes through the shared preferences variables in here. So I can change the settings in multiple places. So I could be on this particular page, and I can again set the settings here, and all of the code goes through this manager right here. So I've got a one-stop shop to handle all of these preference manager details. Let me come back here. One thing I do want to share with you is they do show us how we can access the data on a device. And you can see to do this, we're going to use the Device File Explorer in Android Studio. You're going to go View, Tool Windows, and then Device File Explorer. And you can navigate to your application through this window. So let's go ahead and take a peek at this. Let me make this kilometers just for fun. And so let's go to View, Tool Windows, the Device File Manager. And so now I can navigate through that virtual device that is running. And so I'm going to go to the data directory, not app, data again. And now this is that naming package. So every time you've been creating applications, they get listed in here. So if I scroll down, here's my com.ez VO2 training. That's the particular app that I'm working with here. And if I go into shared prefs, you can see right here, here is the info.xml file. So let's open that up. And here are the settings that I have. So display settings, see how it's false right there? Because true means it is miles. So if I go back to my emulator, let's change this back to miles. And let's see if I can refresh this. I might have to go back through the device manager to do that. The file explorer, sorry. And let me try reopening this. And there you go. There you see it. It changed from false to true. So again, you can see that these are the values that are associated in my application as far as settings. Okay. All right. So next thing to talk about is in section 2, we could work with files if we want to in an Android application. So internal storage is memory inside the actual Android device. So we get access to it using the Get External Files directory. In order to do that, you have to add some permissions in the Android manifest. Now, oh, by the way, some of this information in zyBooks is outdated with the most current versions of the Android SDK. This is legacy and will work as long as you are targeting API level 28 or below. However, if you target a greater version, those implementation details have changed on how to make this work. Back to here, so we provide in the Android manifest the permissions to read or write to external storage. And then where we want to work with the information, we check if we have permission to do that. Again, these details right here, this works on SDK version 28 and before. And what we do is we have a context, we check the permission for a write permission, and if it's granted, great. Otherwise, if not, if you're familiar with an Android device, you get asked if you want to allow access to these particular elements. So same thing applies for if you need to provide access to the camera or provide access to messaging, provide access to maps. This code is very similar in how it gets used. So we have to provide the permissions. And then once we have the permissions to handle the file input and output, if you're familiar with Java, you can use very similar Java constructs. You can create a file output stream, you create the name of the file, you then create a print writer with the output stream, and then you just simply write the content that you want to the file. If you want to, you can also read from an internal file. This is an implementation that I've never done, but I do actually create an internal file that the user can then open on their own. And I think they do go to some details. We're going to kind of skip over most of these details here because you're not going to implement this for the assignments here or for your final term project. But they do give you some details on how to reference the environment, the external storage paths right here. But again, I do want to give you an example. So in my little example here, so let me go back and let me do a calculation. And oh, that's from training. So let me do this. Let's say the 7 minutes. Okay, great. So calculate. So what I actually provide as an option in my application is that they can create a PDF report. So it's going to create a PDF report. And since I have not gone through this code before, you can see that it's asking for permission to have access to media on this device. So I'm going to click allow. And it is going to create a PDF file of that same information that they saw on the last screen. And the reason I do this is they could print this out, put it on their refrigerator, and here are their goals that they want to shoot for. So if you go back to my code, the relevant pieces that you have to use. So if I go into my Android manifest, you can see that you have to have access to write and read external storage here. So I have those included. You can also see that I have an internet permission as well as a network state permission. So behind the scenes of my application, we'll talk about this in a later recording, but what I actually do is every time I hit the calculate button, so I'll go back one more. So when I hit calculate, what I'm actually doing is I'm collecting this information of all the details. I'm sending off a request to my API, and then it's providing me back all of the details that I need to display this information. So I created an API for this, so that way I could use it in an Android application, I could use it in an iOS application, any kind of application could use my API. All right, so back to implementation details. So in my runner information fragment, that's what happens when they click the calculate button before they get directed here, is you can see in here, I've got the updated way of checking for permissions. So this code right here, this is the updated way where you check if your app has permission to use things like the network, internet, maps, messaging, and so forth. Okay, so again, the implementation's been updated because I'm targeting a version greater than 28. Last thing to show you, so in the code that actually creates that PDF file, I actually do create in here. So I have a PDF writer, and it's writing all the details to a PDF file here. And ultimately, what I do is I create a file. I have the path, again, using that get external files directory. Again, you can go back to the zyBooks. This gives me access to the root directory. And so I create my file, I create my output stream, and then I call the write method that will then write the content to a file, and then I call close. So while you see the zyBooks, you can see this is actual code that I have implemented in my little application here. And oh, by the way, you might see that I do have a to-do here that I need to fix my external environment path here. I actually kind of have a hack going on using a legacy code to let me maintain it from what it was before. So again, I've got a to-do here. One of these days, I'm not going to be able to get away with the workaround that I'm using, which means I will have to implement it the correct way. Okay, so that's it for this recording. In here, again, we should know how to work with some shared preferences, and then if you really wanted to create a file on a device, we have that ability.